I also have the privilege of introducing a personal friend of mine, the respondent to Dr. Tonstad's lecture. Dr. Shen Ma is co-director of the Center for Christian Bioethics and assistant professor of religion and ethical studies at Loma Linda University. Before Loma Linda, he served in the United States Navy as a religious program specialist and volunteered as development director for the Adventist Peace Fellowship. While completing his PhD in religion, ethics, and politics at the Claremont School of Theology, he served as associate pastor of the Los Angeles Chinese Seventh-day Adventist Church and as adjunct professor of religion at La Sierra University and Loma Linda University. The focus of his writing, teaching, and research lies at the intersection of mental health, social determinants of health, ethics, and theology. In his spare time, he works as a clinical social work intern at the School of Behavioral Health's Mental Health Clinic, providing trauma-informed psychotherapy to the uninsured population in San Bernardino. Now, this is the bio that he sent me. On a more personal note, Shen is one of my favorite people at the moment. In the little time that we have been colleagues, I have perceived Shen as having a unique mind for many things, among which is his unwavering principles, his impeccably logical thought process that at the same time never loses sight of the person and their feelings, his incredible ability to pick up on unfairness and injustice, his love for truth, justice, and clarity of thought and exposition of ideas have been an inspiration for me. So thank you for accepting to be our respondent for today.
Makes me want to tear up. Thank you so much for that very generous and kind introduction. And after Lynn's excellent lecture on her dancing anthropology, I almost feel like I'm doing an injustice by giving a verbal response. So one of the things I struggled with when preparing for the response is whether or not I should dance the response instead. But given that I want to spare you suffering because of my compassion, I've decided to go with the traditional route. So first of all, I want to thank Linn for gifting the Adventist Society of Philosophers for a wonderful, provocative paper that shows the appreciation for the best of what Adventism has to offer, as well as calls our attention to its limits. So when I accepted the invitation, and I'm grateful for the invitation from my fellow officers on the board, I accepted with fear and trembling. Because I'm not an expert in systematic theology or queer theory or even Adventism, all of which are, Lynn's expertise. And but instead, I'm a lowly theological ethicist. Still, I have long admired Lynn's work and hope that my response today will serve as an adequate conversation starter to move our conversation forward. So in the first part of my response, I highlight what I consider to be Lynn's contributions to the Adventist conversation in theology and philosophy. And in the second half, I raise some questions and concerns about Lynn's theological proposal. And of course, given I'm not an expert, I'm open to hear pushback and Lynn's comment as well. So in her two books, God and Difference and Queer Theology, I find a creative and prophetic voice that skillfully engages the tools of queer theology and the Christian tradition to craft a unique theological vision. Lynn's theological imagination is a refreshing departure from the logic of sacrifice and hierarchical submission that marks so much of Western theology and practice. Her dancing anthropology paints a picture of human relations characterized by horizontal relations of mutual adjustment and intensification. So I was immediately intrigued when I heard that Linn would make the body or the flesh the starting point of her lecture on anthropology. The body is indeed making a comeback in theology, philosophy, and in the social and behavioral sciences. The emphasis on the body is a much needed, I believe, corrective to the influence of Greek and certain modern philosophical traditions that celebrate the spirit and the intellect at the expense of the body and matter. One might say that Adventist thought and practice are prophetic in their insistence on the unity or even identity of the body and the spirit. However, I hesitate to go that far because the body affirmed by many practicing Adventists are in fact abstractions. And by abstractions, I mean the Hegelian Marxian word of abstraction, meaning that it lacks social and historical determination or specification. One example of that is what Marx called the commodity fetishism, right? We look at an iPhone, we love it, it's valuable to us. But what we ignore is the social, political, military relations that makes the production of such a product possible for us, right? We often ignore those types of social relations, which is what makes something abstract. I worry that too many in the Adventist community continue to imagine a body without history, without oppression, without trauma, without social antagonism, or even ethical entanglements. Thus, saying that the body is a starting point is really not to have said much at all. As Linn's lecture makes clear, the body is itself a contested territory. These contests are increasingly violent and traumatic in our society as Christian nationalists mobilize to marginalize lesbian, gay, queer, and transgender bodies. However, the antagonistic struggle is not merely between, say, conservative Christians and the queer community. Citing Gail Rubin, Linn alludes to the complicated and contentious relationship between, for example, the lesbian and transgender communities. So the maps we draw about our bodies have real material consequences for others. And given the instability of all conceptual maps and narratives, no one is capable of living free of violence. Therefore, Linn is suspicious of, quote, our best attempts to be good. And Linn's lecture brings these contested sites and antagonisms to the fore. It forces philosophers and theologians in the Adventist community to confront the issues that we often prefer to leave unaddressed, such as the reification of sex, gender, sexuality. The widespread acceptance of rigid roles, norms, and expectations surrounding gender, sexuality betrays an underlying discomfort with the unruly and complicated dimensions of bodily life, and a lingering attraction to the Greek and modern mode of thinking that seeks to master reality through rigid maps and social discipline. Thus, Linn asserts that Adventism promised but failed to deliver on the law of the body. And I take this to mean that an essentialist anthropology, such as that affirmed by traditional Adventism, simply cannot capture the bodily life's messy, fluid, and mysterious dimensions. Thus, it really cannot fully embrace or celebrate the body as it is. Given these shortcomings in Adventist theology, Linn appropriately ends with a dancing anthropology. Now, what could be more scandalous than dancing? Consistent with her book, God and Difference, Linn's anthropology breaks with the traditional theological focus on the essence of human nature and instead characterizes human beings as fundamentally relational and in motion. If human nature is characterized by movement, it is then never settled or stable. Instead, human nature is what we continue to discover as we adjust to each other in joint rhythmic coordination and collaboration. However, there are several ambiguities in the lecture that I believe deserve further consideration. First, the apocalypticism of some of Linn's earlier works seems to have dropped out of view in this lecture. I mentioned apocalypticism because I believe it could clarify some of the background assumptions of Linn's dancing anthropology. In the last section on choreomania, Linn devotes some length to addressing the fear of dancing as disorderly, unregulatable, and disruptive. Now, one might ask why Linn highlights the transgressive and creative dimensions of dance, as she also acknowledges that there are ordered and more regulated forms of dance as well. Now, this emphasis makes sense given the background of Linn's apocalyptic theology, I think. In apocalyptic theologies, God works more through discontinuities than continuities. So she writes in God and Difference, quote, God's action on and for humankind gives humankind a destiny beyond what is given in creation, an unnatural end, unquote. Quote. Linn's God judges the world from beyond space and time. The world, including our current conception of what is natural and good, is passing away, or should give way to the new. The interruption of interruption is what characterizes the coming of God. This apocalypticism is perhaps another way Linn's theology still resonates with certain strands of Adventism and helps to illuminate her suspicion of humans' attempt to be good. If what we take to be moral and decent is full of ambiguities and potentially even violent, then even our best efforts at being good must be subjected to divine judgment. As a theological ethicist, though, I wonder if Linn's think my field is inherently ideological in its attempt to discern or define justice. Is she trying to make me go without a job, right? How might we make everyday judgments of right and wrong or distinguish justice from injustice? How might we know whether we have learned, to use a phrase in her lecture, to do antagonism better? I'm sympathetic to the apocalypticism and the critical thrust of Linn's dancing anthropology. However, it seems that I won't be able to tell whether we're dancing well with others without some additional normative criteria. In other words, what is the source of moral knowledge and wisdom? Is there an invisible hand, right, governing dancing relations such as it guarantees the emergence of enriching relationships rather than reproducing oppression? However, if one were to interrogate the norms governing dancing, one must somehow treat dance as a rule-governed activity, like a language of other forms of social practice. So a second ambiguity I find in the lecture is thus the relationship between the body and language. Linn states that dance precedes and grounds language. And since dance precedes language, perhaps it must also precede norms and rules. Nevertheless, Linn recounts learning to read body language as a raver and acknowledges the risk of interpretive failure. If dance is pre-linguistic, what might it mean to misread the body? It seems then that dancing may be a rule-governed activity or practice after all, with the same risk and ambiguities that plague other forms of social practices. If dance is rule-governed, then we can ask critical questions about the norms, cultures, and underlying assumptions that organize it. So these questions lead me to the third ambiguity in the paper, which is the connection between dancing anthropology and social antagonisms. In Linn's account of the Butch-Femme relationships, she teases out the class and racial dimensions of gender construction. Against the middle class characterization of Butch-Femme as reproducing heterosexuality, Linn shows how working class and Black lesbian culture transcends the gender binary of male and female. Race and class are thus intertwined with gender and sexuality. Now, living in the aftermath of neoliberal economic system and culture that exploits the bodies of laborers, especially Black and brown bodies, how might dancing escape such antagonisms? Are there divides in our society that are not bridgeable by dancing? What if the music selection represents the culture of a particular class, race, and ethnicity? Would not some feel alienated or marginalized? What if some do feel self-conscious or have social anxiety and don't have the courage to dance without invitation? What if some have a physical disability that prevents them from moving or adjusting as efficiently as others? I worry that without further critical examination, dancing anthropology may risk remaining as abstract as the Adventist anthropology of which Linn is rightly critical. Linn acknowledges that the body is a simultaneously natural and cultural artifact. If so, the body and by extension, dance is necessarily shaped by a social habitat already permeated by class, race, and a history of oppression. This history would have various impacts on different bodies. These concerns, which were prominent in the first half of the lecture, seems to be marginalized towards the end. Of course, I do not think that dancing is meant to be a panacea in Linn's anthropology. However, I think it is worth asking whether the same critical suspicion Linn has for the rhetoric of virtue and goodness can also apply to the dance floor. We might not be able to construct a blueprint for utopia or finally resolve these social conflicts, but does that mean we should not fight for better institutional arrangements that might bring slightly more justice or equity? But doing so requires activists, leaders, and politicians to draw provisional maps, to legislate new laws and enact new policies, knowing that new injustices might emerge. In other words, regulation and discipline might not always be negative things to be discarded, but the very conditions of social justice. Perhaps as much energy should go into drawing maps as into deconstructing them. At the end of the lecture, I am left wondering about the practices accompanying Linn's dancing anthropology. I am curious about what this anthropology looks like in practice. Is it that churches should incorporate more dancing in their worship programs? And some churches already do. I wonder if more Adventists start to dance on the Sabbath, it will move the community towards greater justice and solidarity. Indeed, some will find it scandalous or threatening. Others might appreciate the change. However, since dance, like other social practices, is embedded within an ideological and historical context, I am not entirely confident that dancing can finally make up for the failures of denaturalization and anti-essentialism in dethroning reigning ideologies of gender, sexuality, race, and neoliberal capitalism. I believe dancing will teach us new ways to be with and for each other in a way that other practices do not, right? So I'm not denying the creative potential and possibility of dancing. Still, I am unsure if dancing would render marginalized bodies in our midst more visible in practice. In sum, Linn is correct in lamenting the failures of the denaturalization and anti-essentialism as adequate tools of social justice. Making the body the point of departure for philosophical anthropology is also the right move, I believe. However, I hesitate to fully embrace Linn's dancing anthropology because I'm uncertain how social antagonisms can be successfully negotiated on the dance floor. More importantly, I worry that the nonverbal sociality dancing provides may, in its own way, cover up social antagonisms that require critical examination and Socratic questioning. I hope this response serves to raise some questions that would lead to some good conversations. Thank you so much.
Couple of minutes for Dr. Tonstad to respond if you want to, and then we'll open for about 15, 20 minutes of Q&A.
Thank you for that marvelous and incredibly thoughtful response. And I'll only pick up a very couple of the things. There is a whole set of disclaimers that one is supposed to do when talking about dance that I decided to skip today, which apparently may have been a mistake. The rave is not a utopia. It does not overcome anything that, it brings everything with it to the dance floor. I've written extensively on the way that, historical conflicts meet each other on the dance floor, quite specifically, actually. But I thought that the final part emphasizing the racialization of dancing was intending to speak somewhat sideways, admittedly, but to exactly the point that you're raising, that worries about dancing are typically associated with whiteness and with the regulation of the bourgeois productive subject. Quite specifically, this has to do with the fact that dancing requires enormous number of hours, right? And these hours are often happening at night in communities that are typically Black and brown led, and typically led by gender non-normative people. Right? And all of this goes together because the kinds of lives that sustain dancing practices are not always coincident with the kinds of lives that sustain neoliberal productivity. Now, there are, of course, huge exceptions to this, which is Silicon Valley's love for Burning Man. Right? And there's a lot we could say about that. I think in this particular context, The positive that I was looking for here was in the reading of the Butch Femme sort of relational antagonism. What happens when you learn different maps of how people engage with one another, the attentiveness to the body that's required in order to learn those maps. That's exactly the non-abstract, right? I think that's part of what I'm looking for here, because these are among the places where people create themselves, right? Where people try on other identities or discover new capacities in themselves. You know, the other sort of concerns that there's a very standard every time I talk about this. What about differently abled persons? What about people with bodily? I don't want to make a thing of other people's limitations. So I'll just say a couple of things about that. I have raved with people with extreme bodily debility. There are contexts. There are very few dance floors that are set up to invite them, but they do exist. They're an unbelievable privilege to be on in occasion, but it's also one of the other parts that's that for me lies underneath this interest is mortality, right? And mortality including debility, the reality that what my body can do today may or may not be what my body can do tomorrow. And that dancing always reflects that. It always places me in the asymmetry between one shoulder and the other, and the kinds of movements through the earth, and with a pen in my hand that have generated those asymmetries and so on. So I think what I was primarily after in this particular talk was what happens when this is neglected or disappears. Not so much that dancing can be a kind of magical, dissolution of all. I mean, there are moments when it will feel that way, right? There are definitely moments when it will feel that way. And there can be some translatability between that feeling and other practices. But I think some of the most concrete consequences have to do with the relationship between the destruction of dancing and gentrification practices that have to do with zoning laws in particular, that have to do with the way that licensing practices have always been modes of being able to arrest disorderly bodies under police states, pretty specifically and directly. And so I think there is on even the negative side a kind of positive drive towards some of what you're after. I think that's too much more to talk about, I think, but just a few sort of, yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, we'll take questions. Can we either?
Yeah, would you come and also?
Thank you so much. This was so refreshing, fun, and not at all like I thought academia is supposed to be. Anyways, first of all, can I just make comments?
Please.
Because this is so inspiring. So first of all, thank you for explaining the rave to me. My nephew is a ravist. I don't know how you say it. He's a DJ.
Huh?
No one understands him. We think he's a loser. And now I get it. Thank you. Second thing is I loved about what you said, what struck me was the notion flesh matters. And I just realized that this is how Jesus interacted with people. He didn't impose on the flesh like we do. He responded to the flesh desires. So I think that's so important to remember. Jesus is not saying, no, your flesh there, no, let me fix it. But he was really responding to a desire coming from the flesh. So I'm curious what that would look like, right? It expanded this notion. So I love that. And then finally, okay, the dancing is never gonna happen. I'm just but I think I see where you're going, and I think I have an alternative. That might work. What I'm noticing, what I'm getting from what you're saying is that instead of looking for unity that is conceptual, why not look in unity in the flesh as a church? Right? We have been working on making unity conceptual. The recent decision to not ordain women, in the name of conceptual unity, it was extremely problematic for me. But this notion that you're bringing a new definition of unity, which I think we should explore and ponder, which is unity in the flesh. And I find a perfect exemplification in this in the Lord's Supper. Judas was at the table. Simon the Zealot was at the table. Matthew, Luke, John, all these guys who disagreed. Even Judas, the fact that he was part of the table, deeply disagreeing with Jesus, but eating together, dwelling together, and that's what is Christianity, in my view, is the ability to dwell together in the flesh That's what matters. The rest. So I think that's what you were getting to, and I would like to offer a different version of the Lord's Supper, a dancing Lord's Supper, which maybe we could at least begin, and then maybe one day, right? But yeah, that would be my response. Thank you so much. Yeah.
I mean, I love that, and I really appreciate all of that. I've never, why can't foot washing be that, right? Why can't foot washing? What would have to happen, right, for foot washing to do some of this, right? Stranger intimacy with the bodies of others, preferably people you really, really hate, right? This is important. Yeah. Yeah. I think it can.
Been in small churches and different places with brutalized events and lots of disagreements politically and stuff. I think it does happen. I think church is much more healthy than people. I feel like either they don't get out enough or see it. It's just a lot more. There's a lot of publicity out there that disregards what happens in small, out of the way, dysfunctional churches. It's quite glorious. And I just find there's dancing that's taking place out there phenomenally in multiple ways. But I do thank you for this one doctrine. This one thing about dancing, it just never made sense. It's something you get to.
Thank you. Sharing. Even if you made a kind concession to Adventists, if I understood it correctly, the question is not flesh, yes or not, but rather how flesh. Because discipline flesh, as is in Adventist, is not flesh, because flesh is necessarily prayer. I agree completely with you in that, but the discipline flesh is not only a problem of Adventism, it's a problem of the Western culture. It's not in a peripheral matters, but in central matters. Medicine, for instance. Medicine, the anticipatory course, book of the is a discipline flesh. So it's a big problem. Dance, I agree. The Estes by Glassing from Shopful, both ones book. Very insightful. Dance, okay. The word started as a dance. But also with dance, I have a problem. Because not the dance, yes or not, but how. Because the dance that exists today in the Western world is, after all, lived as an exception, as a kind of break to maintain the routine mechanical endeavor. And when it's like this, I say not dance because it's a kind of narcotic, but it's not what you were saying. I will just quote Husserl in the fifth Cartesian meditation, makes the distinction between corporate and life. And he says, corporate is the measured body. Life is the relational body, is a way of living, is work related. So it's not an exception, but a continuous way of life. So thank you for all the your sharing that is really insightful, helpful to renew Adventism.
I mean, I love that point about the break, especially, right? One of the again, one of the typical disclaimers you're supposed to do, right, is around, oh, well, sometimes, dance just makes you, survive in capitalism more. But there's nothing about which that can't be said at this point, right? There's nothing where we can sort of find that one, sure, doing good to the poor or something like that. But there too, we know that, right, like social workers who don't take time for themselves and to restitute will become so drained that they become unable to function. Or for me, when I'm so frustrated with my colleagues sometimes. And I take that with me onto the dance floor, and I'm able to come back next week sort of renewed and sustained and kinder, more generous, more patient. Yes, that's sort of sustaining capitalism because Yale's at the heart of it, but at the same time, that is still a better world, right? It's still a slightly gentler world, right? Where we find ways to do these things. And there is also, I think, a sort of complicated, it's Eindeutigkeit, right, in relation to discipline, because to get the real thing, the thing that is sort of worth maybe reorganizing your life around, you have to be willing to wait, and you have to be there has to be a kind of discipline of maybe even hedonism, we could call it. You have to drag yourself out at 2 a.m. in the winter night because finally the drinkers are going home, right? You have to pull yourself out of your nice warm bed. You have to drag yourself out there. You have to survive the pushing of the irritating people until the floor has sort of cleared, maybe around 5 if you're lucky. These days in New York, it's even later. And that's a post-pandemic thing that we could also talk about. And those kinds of practices have, for me, I think, given new life to a certain kind of strand of aesthetic discussion in Christianity that I tended to be pretty hostile towards. So I've learned something in that direction too.
Bonnie.
Well, I just had to add that Adventism does have a very, very small history of movement together in grand marches that existed back in the 1980s. And also the marching that we did in very dancing rhythm.
And obviously, like marching together in time can take us some pretty horrible places very quickly, right? Again, I don't want to suggest that there's a sort of unambiguous sort of version of any of this, but with most things that are truly important, there's a true version and there's a false version, maybe many false versions, but at least one true version and a false version. And they sound exactly the same. They're the same words. They're the same sort of motion in some cases even, but one of them is true and the other one is a lie, and the worst kind of lie, an antichrist kind of lie, because it gives itself out to be the real thing. And these are not, there will not be places where we will agree on exactly which version is which or where the line is drawn between them. But part of the risk taking I'm interested in is trying to put oneself in the place of one's own judgment in that regard, and then to have exchanges around that, right? To try to map, and it has to be a sort of, it has to be picture talk, I think, to try to map where does something, sort of tip into the lie. How do you keep yourself close to the edge, close to the truth? And that goes to something that, we were talking a little bit about this morning. Some of that may not be communicable. Some of that may be, it has to be discovered for the self. The mystics have typically told us this, right? That they can't sort of tell us how to get to the good place we're there, or through the bad places to the good place. There is no way around the through. And I think that is, it's not going to be the thing, the idea of dancing or the idea of the synchronization that saves us. But people can sometimes learn to be together a little better. That's real. And when we pretend that that's, then, yeah, I think, yeah, you get the point.
Jim.
Lynn, I wonder if you would finally agree that you are overly optimistic about this anthropology you're suggesting. And even if it may border on being a human nature, a model of human nature for the elite. I mean, I see you and gay people generally, as I have come to know them over the years and about them, as more financially successful, more talented than the general population, and And now if that those same people and others can dance, I mean, that's excluding others. So it seems like it's an elite group who are able to appreciate the fluidity that you described that some people are able to do, and that takes emotional and intellectual and spiritual maturity. I mean, the idea of idealism. What do you make of that, George?
That's fantastic. That's really nicely done. I mean, we can contest a lot of those details, right? In particular, there have been some revisions of the financial sort of stuff that people used to have. But the actuality of it is that in most of these spaces, some of us are guests in others' homes in certain ways, right? And are learning from people whose risk-taking has been different than ours, and learning something about what it might be to be relatively less protected in the world as a result of that. There are many ways to learn these things, right? There are many ways to live in close adjacency / face-to-faceness / proximity / whatever you want to call it with people who are really different from yourself. But this is one of them, right? And I think a lot about spatiality, because these are very concrete questions, right? The question of the sort of elite version of that access, right, is who can own a dancing space, right? Who has that kind of money? In many contexts, there's sort of DIY scenes, right? But tomorrow night here in Detroit, one of the greatest DJs, just full stop, Robert Hood, is going to be playing. And Robert Hood is a Black minister of the gospel, who is one of the greatest house DJs in the entire world, and who starts his DJ sets by invoking the Lord. He absolutely sees what he's doing as part of his preaching of the gospel. And he's playing at a bottle service club here in Denver. Sorry, did I say Detroit? There may be a reason for that. Here in Denver. Detroit is the home of techno, right? And Chicago of house. But you know, that tells us something, right, about what kind of conditions have to be there in order for people to make a living off of these kinds of practices, right? I mean, a bottle service club is for rich people, right? And you cannot dance at a bottle service club. It cannot be done. It's impossible, right? And yet at the same time, those are the spaces that financially support parts of the culture. And that's a really hard, it's a hard reality. And there's a lot of difficulty in there, I think.
All right.
We should all go over here, Robert Hood.
2 more questions and then we'll close our time together. So we'll have Jasper and then Jason.
Thanks for the talk. As a burgeoning academic, it's just good to see like the different kind of delivery. It's not stale. I appreciate that. I had a question about the way Adventism is being used, because it seems like what it's locating is morphing as it's being like involved in the conversation. And so when you were talking about prohibition, so growing up Adventist, I thought about the movies, right? Like you weren't supposed to go to the movie theater, and then the invention of Blockbuster, and like people found a way to watch the movies that they weren't watching the movie theater, and this was like broad, like it was a lot, right? So now I was thinking about dancing, and I suspect that there are a lot of Adventists across the spectrum that dance.
Yeah.
But there's this ecclesiological reason for not acknowledging that, right? You disfellowship, whatever. So I'm envisioning pockets of Adventists dancing at home who will then like also participate in the prohibition of dancing.
Right.
So why doesn't and I'm curious what if this question makes sense, like why doesn't the dancing at home invade the space? Like what is blocking that this singular dancing in the quiet? Like why doesn't it work? Why doesn't it translate So I'm curious what you
Yeah.
think about if the question makes sense.
No, it makes perfect sense, and that's a beautiful, it's a beautiful point, I think, too, because there is no way around also the sort of racialization of movement, the reality that there are probably fewer white American and European Adventists who dance than non-white Adventists who dance. That's a bet that I'm going off of, but I would strongly bet on it globally. The home doesn't involve for the stranger intimacy. That I think is one of the really crucial parts. When it's in the home or in the period of lockdown, when people tried to do Zoom events of this kind, I mean, the sadness of it is really hard to describe, because one of the things that makes a dance story exciting is when the unexpected happens. And the unexpected at home, right, with people you know or with people you've intentionally invited in, versus the sudden flash when you see someone across the room and you realize they've seen you, or when somebody comes up to you, one of the most magical things that can happen, oh, I've just really enjoyed your energy all night. And you're like, you saw me? Like that experience, right, of stranger appreciation and engagement. And, you know, that again, it's not magic, right? Because nothing is, but we've not got a lot of options left, friends. And we've got to try.
David will ask our last question.
Yeah, I hate to be the last one, because I just want to thank you for acknowledging that there might be people in the room who just disagree with a lot of this. I would be one of them. At the same time, I come to these things because I usually always find something enriching in what's shared, and I definitely did in your paper. Where I connected in what you said in the Q&A was talking about that it can be really hard to do this stuff, right? Like, the things you give up, the comforts and so forth, in order to, seek out these goods. And for me, what I'm passionate about as an Adventist aspiring pastor theologian is trying to preserve those bits of Adventism that are hard, but because we're trying to attain to, now here I'm heavily influenced by Charles Taylor, transcendent goods, right? And I see the imminent frame just, sucking everybody, regardless of their orientation and, whatever politically, culturally, just, living for the here and now, right? And I guess my question would be then, with the bodily anthropology that you're proposing, is there any room for transcendent goods in that? Or is it, natural human goods that you primarily have in mind when it comes to this bodily anthropology?
I mean, one way to get at that is to say that there will be dancing before the throne of God in heaven, guaranteed.
I'm not arguing,
right? But I just sort of taking up a little bit there. Yeah. There's also, I really respect and honor the sort of work that people have put in Adventism to maintaining an alternative form of life, right? Growing up with that and seeing the costliness of it taught me so much that has been of use. I also can't get away from the fact that Adventism turned me into a cop, right? Adventism turned me into a police person of other people's behavior and my own. It turned me into somebody who was a, instead of all the other things, right? And one of the, I'm not talking here primarily about policing as a debatable social practice, right? But about policing as a mode of interacting with other human beings. That German love for you put the recycling in the wrong bin and I got you, right? That thing, like killing that in ourselves, is also killing the devil, right? Very few words left. So,